as Kathleen just mentioned, water to the Hawaiian people and in Hawaiian culture is a very important element. And as she also mentioned, vai is the Hawaiian word for water, and vai is the duplication of the word, and it also means wealth. And so if you were living in a place where there was lots of water, you were considered a wealthy person. And frankly, most Hawaiians considered themselves pretty wealthy because it rains a lot here on these islands, even on the sunny South Shore. So one of the things I wanted to share with you today is that I've been asked several times since I've been back to Hawaii to do a blessing. And sometimes it's a blessing of a home or a recreational area or a business. And every time I've done a blessing, I take a bowl with me and I bring a tea leaf because that is the Hawaiian tradition for blessing. And I dip the tea leaf in the water and I sprinkle all that's around me. You thought there was water in here. Sorry about that. But anyway, everyone, imagine you're getting sprinkled and blessed. But the idea is that, you know, when something begins anew, it's important to cleanse. It's important to purify from anything harmful or evil that may have happened in that place before. And it's important to remind ourselves of a new beginning. And then there's that word in Hawaiian called pono. And it's in the state motto, and it's translated righteousness. And I'll just tell you, I think that translation came primarily from the missionaries, but long before the missionaries came to Hawaii, pono didn't mean righteousness. That was a new word to the Hawaiian people. Pono really means goodness. It means to live in harmony and balance with yourself, within yourself, with the people around you, and with your community. But fundamentally, it means to live from your essence. To live from your being, who you really are. And so pono is a celebration of one's essence, and it can be the essence of the place. So if I'm blessing a new home, I'm celebrating what that home is, what it means. And in baptism, as we're talking about today, it occurred to me as I was thinking about the whole concept of blessing with water, that the entire theme translates to Christian baptism. Think about it. Pono. It's an acknowledgement of who we are in God's eyes. Think about cleansing. It's about being cleansed from anything that needs cleansing. It could be sins, it could be something that's wrong in a relationship. It's about purification, and it's about a new beginning. So as we talk about the baptism of John the Baptist, who, in other words, he was the one that was doing the baptism, and the baptism of Jesus, the one being baptized, I think it's really important, before we really get into that, to look at the context of what's really going on in the first few chapters of Matthew, namely chapter 1 and 2, because we're beginning today's scripture in chapter 3, verse 1. So I know on Christmas Eve, I shared with you about the figures that are up here on the communion table, and how we often think of these figures as just so much joy and meaning from things that we've experienced in our childhoods and things we've been told. But what I shared with everybody on Christmas Eve, just in case you weren't here, is everybody up here is, except for the angel, of course, someone who's marginalized. And if you think about it, the shepherds were the men who smelled really bad. They hung out with the sheep. They did the work that nobody else wanted to do, and they were kind of looked down upon by the rest of society. And then the Magi, last week I told you we don't know if there was 3 because the Bible doesn't really say, but that's kind of become part of our tradition. All we know is they brought 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But these are foreigners from the East, people with a strange religion and a strange way of doing things. They were not highly welcome by people where they showed up to, Jerusalem. And then they went from there to Bethlehem. But again, marginalized people. And then Joseph, I said, was just kind of your average guy. Nothing really special, just doing a good day's work, but barely making enough to live by. And then Mary was the scandalous one. She was the unwed new mother who basically, in her society, was looked down upon more than anyone else. And of course, Jesus, we think of as, here's this holy event, and it's just such a happy scene. But back 2,000 years ago, this was actually a marginalized scene and a scandalous scene. Why would a baby be placed in a feeding trough belonging to strangers because his parents were so poor and so marginalized, that's all they could afford? So imagine not just the warm fuzzies that you get at Christmas time, but also imagine the sense of being marginalized. I was thinking about the word margin today, and I was thinking about, you look at a page in a book, you're reading a novel, and everything that's written is part of the story. The margins are where you write the notes. It's the stuff that's not really a part of the story. And my guess is we've all felt like that at some point in life, that we don't really belong, or we're kind of out on the margins. But everything you see up here is a marginalized scene. Now I'm going to invite you today in Matthew chapter 3, because this is Matthew chapter 1 and 2. I want to invite you to go far beyond these margins, even farther than this, out into the wilderness, where John the Baptist was. The wilderness was a place where no one really wanted to live. It was a place where people were afraid to live. It was a place where people just thought, that's where people live with the wild animals. And of course, John the Baptist was one of those people, about as marginalized as possible, living way the heck out there. And nevertheless, he, like the rest of the figures here, were called by God to do something significant in the world. So these figures were called by God to welcome Jesus into the world. John the Baptist was called by God to baptize Jesus, to begin something brand new. And again, going back to what I said about the blessing of water, not only to begin something new, but to cleanse, to purify. So John the Baptist was someone that you would think was so marginalized. Why would God use him in any way whatsoever? But that gives me hope. Because if God could and did use John the Baptist in such a powerful way, and used him in a way to do something significant in the world, then certainly God can use me. And God can use you. As I think about these words, it gives me great hope today, in today's society. Because as I look around and as I listen to the news, nationally and internationally, it seems like there's always great reason to get discouraged and just think, well, I'm just a little person living here on Kauai. What can I do to make a difference in the world? But again, if God can use John the Baptist, who was way more marginalized than any of us, God can use us. So this past week, I was thinking about this polarization that has happened in our world, not just in America, but all over the world. But we do see it here. We see Democrats and Republicans just getting further and further apart from each other. We see Christians and Muslims getting further and further apart from each other. We see Sunnis and Shias getting further and further apart from each other. And people keep saying, well, that's okay, because those people on the other side of the pole are wrong and we're right. And as I think about that, I think, oh my gosh, we've become a society, a world where it's okay to hate each other and push people away because we're right and they're wrong. And I guess that's always been sort of how it's been, but it's become a lot more public this past year and these past few years. The other thing that I have found discouraging is when I look out into the world, I see that our way of communicating with each other just encourages that polarization. When you watch the news, you see people demonizing somebody simply because they disagree with them. Well, if you don't disagree with me, you've got to be evil. And so that gives me the right to treat you like an evil person, which is almost as bad as saying, that's that gives me the right to treat you like a non-person because you're so bad. And I also look around and I see people communicating in other ways where it's like you can take the truth and twist it and spin it so much that it looks like anything but the truth. And yet because you've started with the truth, you're convinced that it still is. And I've seen people over and over again in the news saying things, criticizing other people in ways that are really harmful to those other people just so you can get your own way or promote your own agenda. And when I look at all this, sometimes I just get discouraged and I think, who am I to make any difference? Just live here and work at this little church where I love, but I don't know if I can make that big of a difference in the world. And then I look at this idea of violence that I've talked about before, where war just seems more and more the norm. That's how we take care of things. We kill other people. And terrorism in the last 15 years or so has definitely been on the rise. And we keep thinking, well, we got to protect ourselves, and we should. But I also look at gun violence and how that has increased even more. In fact, I was looking at some statistics this last week saying that I think it was 33,000 people in the last 15 years, so since 9/11 basically, or including 2001. Actually, the statistic was from 2001 to 2013. So in 12 years, 33,000 people died by acts of terrorism, either in our country or Americans abroad. 33,000 people. That's hard for us to wrap our minds around. In just 12 years, over 30,000 people, either in our country or Americans abroad, were killed by terrorism. But I also read that more than 140,000 people were killed by non-terroristic gun violence. And we keep talking about what a problem this is, but we don't seem to get to the point that we are making any difference. When something like 120 times more people are killed by guns in our country than all the terroristic activity combined in that same period of time, tells me that there's not a whole lot I can do. I'm just an average guy that looks out in the world and says, what great problems we have. But again, I get back to this message from Matthew chapter 3, that if God can use John the Baptist, the most marginalized people so far in the story, in a powerful way, and that God can make the world a better place through John the Baptist, then I think God can do the same through me and through you. Which leads to the question, but how? How can I make a difference? What am I supposed to do? And I wish I had a magic wand where I could just say that this is what you're supposed to do, and that's what you're supposed to do, and that's what you're supposed to do. But frankly, I don't know what God is calling any of us to do. I think I know what God's called me to do, at least for now. But when we look at Matthew chapter 3, we see a story of a baptism. And in that story, we learn some really important things. Number one, God seems to keep showing up out on the margins, way the heck out there. Over and over again, God isn't showing up in Jerusalem at the temple where everyone's expecting God to show up in this amazing way. God's showing up out in a feeding trough. God's showing up out in the wilderness, which tells me maybe I need to spend some more time out on the margins. Two things come to my mind. Maybe I need to spend some more time just kind of out in the wilderness where I can just listen to the birds and unfortunately sometimes the helicopters that seem to never stop on this island, but just to get outside and be alone with God, but also to go to the margins where people are, the marginalized people. And I think that's one thing that our church does pretty well, and we're doing more and more marginalized people ministry. But I think if we really want to see how God's going to use us, we need to get out there to the margins and be there with the people and get to know the people who are living on those margins. What else do we learn from the story? Well, God seems to keep showing up in unexpected ways, doesn't God? Look at this. Everyone, including the 3 wise men, went to Jerusalem thinking, well, the next king of the Jews is going to be born in a royal family right there in Jerusalem, but this is the next king. And then John the Baptist realized when Jesus actually showed up at the Jordan River, everything was the opposite of what John was expecting. Because he had already said, I'm not even worthy to hold or carry the sandals of Jesus. And he certainly expected Jesus to come and baptize him. But Jesus really surprised him, didn't he? When he said, oh no, I want you to baptize me. And John just said, oh no, that's just, I ought to be baptized by you. And Jesus said, it's the right thing to do. And so John was willing to change his whole paradigm of how God shows up, to change his whole way of thinking about what God wanted him to do. And when he realized what it was, he was willing to do it. And so I think that's the second lesson for us. We all have our ideas about God, and we all have our ideas about how God's working in the world, but God works in surprising ways, and sometimes God asks us to do things that might just be the opposite of what we think we're supposed to do. So I invite you also to think about how God might be showing up to you this year in a really surprising and unexpected way, and to be willing just to say, okay. The third thing that pops into my mind that we can learn from this story is God shows up to people who are preparing for God to show up. So all those people that were coming to John at the Jordan, they were getting baptized to symbolize their own cleansing, to symbolize their own purification, to prepare themselves for however God was showing up for them. They were coming to prepare for God to show up. So I also invite you to prepare in whatever way you do for God to show up in your life. And there's many ways we do that, and how I do it might be really different from how some of you do it, but I hope you spend some time in prayer. I hope you spend some time reflecting on the scriptures. I already know you spend some time in church because you're right here already. You might want to spend some time in the wilderness, alone, just with the birds and, the helicopters. But just to be out there saying, God, I'm ready. I'm preparing myself for however it is that you want to show up in my life. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, what we learn from this story come from those final words, a voice from heaven when Jesus is finally baptized. God says, this is my child, my beloved, in whom I am well pleased. Think about that for just a moment. What it must have been like for Jesus as he's preparing to do something significant in this world. To hear the voice of God saying, you are my child. You are my beloved. In you, I am well pleased. And think about this. Jesus had not even begun his public ministry yet. It's not like at the end of his public ministry and all the great teaching and all the great miracles, God said, well, I'm pleased with all this now that you've proved yourself. No. God says before Jesus did any of that, I'm so pleased with you, just as you are. Which gets me back not only to baptism, but to that word pono again. Meaning, in your essence, whatever it is that you are, God is so pleased with that. God is pleased with you perfectly as you are. Nothing needs to change. In God's eyes, you're perfect. And the reason is because you're a child of God and because you're God's beloved. Now imagine with me, I know this might be a little bit of a stretch, but what if we all truly believe that about ourselves? How would that change the world? How would that change you? And then the next step, what if we truly believe that about everyone else? Even the people that we're afraid of, even the people that scare us to death. What if we believe that they too are God's children? That they are God's beloved? and that God is so pleased with them just as they are. My hope and prayer for us during this new year is that we will learn to do that. That we will remember our baptisms, our own cleansing, and our willingness to start anew, and that we will remember that those words for Jesus are also the words for us. You are my child. You are my beloved. In you, I am so very, very well pleased.